This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Deepa Mehta, thank you so much for being here and joining us and celebrating the opening of Sir Salman's archive. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much, but I have to say something. My daughter, who's here with me, Devyani, said to me this morning after we spent the evening with a group of the faculty and Salman and Christopher, and she said, Mom, you're going to be on this symposium and you're going to be with Christopher and Salman. Are you sure you want to be there? And I thought she had a point, so I'm going to just put that on the table.
It's wonderful how much faith our children have in us.
I know. So touching.
I guess I would start also by asking you about your friendship with Sir Salman and how it came about, how you came to be friends.
It started with Water. It's a film I did, and there was a preview screening in New York, and a common friend was organizing it, and she said, you know, one of the people who's going to be there is Salman Rushdie. And I said, oh, please don't call him. And she said, what? And I said, you know, supposing he hates it. And, you know, it was a real fear at that point that this man who I'd idolized for a long time would hate my film. And she said, you've got to take risks. So I said, okay. And Salman came for the screening and sat through it, and we talked briefly after that, and he sort of let me know that he was quite moved by it. And I got back to Toronto and told my distributor that, guess what? Salman said he liked the film, and he said, why don't you email him and ask him if he'll do a blurb for the poster? And I said, no, he just can't go that far. But I was sort of desperate enough that I did it. And luckily, Salman, being the true gentleman he is, wrote a beautiful blurb, which was used in all the posters all over the world. And I was really relieved that he didn't say anything nasty. And that's how it all started. And we started talking and became friends. And one day, I think, and we said we must work together. And we were sitting at dinner or something about a year and a half ago, and again talking about we have to work together. And he said, which book would you like to do? And I said, Midnight's Children. And he said, done. And it was just fabulous. So thank you, Salman.
And I should put in a plug here. You will be speaking about that process.
Yes.
Sunday at 5 o'clock in the tall auditorium of the law school, and you are all welcome to come and hear about that amazing process. I understand.
It has been. Yeah.
Turning the novel into a 135-page screenplay.
Yes, and I just have to add something small about it. After Salman finished writing the screenplay, which was, you know, a challenge, I think, for somebody who's written such a beautiful, iconic book, and it came down to 130 pages, and he emailed me the 130 pages, and he said, perhaps I should have written a shorter book.
For next time. Your films are, well, certainly the Elements trilogy, which we just screened here the last 3 weeks, depict a culture and society that oppresses and ostracizes women. And yet, they are films that are full of love and loving relationships. And I was wondering if you could talk about that juxtaposition that characterizes your films in the trilogy. Even in describing the trilogy, you have said that these are elements that nurture and destroy us. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that juxtaposition, with these characters who suffer so much and yet manage to do so much for others. A
question that I've been asked very often, and I sort of and I always like the opportunity to clarify it, is this, that when I write a screenplay, or it always starts not with what's my message going to be, or is it going to be about this poor woman who discovers she's a lesbian, or a poor woman who's a widow. It's not about that. It always generally starts with a story. And the story of Fire, for example, started with something that my mother had told me years ago. They lived in a joint family with her sister-in-laws, and though they did not have a lesbian relationship, it was the emotional nurturing that in a joint family the sister-in-laws provided with each other, and they became sort of this united front against my grandmother, who's a real tyrant, I believe, that actually saw them through some really tricky situations in a joint family in India. So that was the story that actually inspired Fire, and I came to the point of saying that if two women in contemporary India today, did something that wasn't socially acceptable, what would the fallout be? So it wasn't about the messages about any kind of sitting on a podium and talking about it, but rather the story of two women who help each other, and who give each other dignity under most difficult circumstances. And it was later, after Fire came out, that papers were written about it, that I said, my God, I guess I've done something that's political, but it never struck me while I was doing it.
And the subsequent two films, was it a similar process?
A similar process. I wanted to do something about the partition because Rwanda was happening around the same time, and the idea of sectarian war and what war does to people, and also a sentence that I'd read by Bapsi Sidhwa, where she said, all wars are fought on women's bodies, stuck with me, and I thought, it would be very interesting doing the partition from a female point of view and through a friend's point of view. And then I sort of honed on to Ice Candy Man, which is the book that was adapted and became Earth.
And Water as well?
Water
you wanted to tell a particular story without...
Again, through the eyes of a child, because then it's a gaze that's very precocious and can be cruel, but is inherently sort of innocent. And the challenge of doing that, and I was already shooting a film in Varanasi when I had my first sort of interaction with even though my grandmothers were widows and I knew about widows, but the whole sort of institutionalization of widows happened in I think it was the 1980s for the first time, and that's when I met Gyanvati, who lived in an institution in Varanasi, and when I went to the house of widows for the first time, I was just shattered. Because, of course, not only were these women just in the house and completely deprived of dignity again, but also there was a curtain made out of saris, and I said, what's going on? And one was for Brahmin widows, and on the other side were the Kshatriya widows. So even within the house, there was this demarcation, and it was, and that became the birth of Water.
It is striking that in Earth and Water, the stories are told through the eyes of a child. And I was wondering about that, and I'm glad you brought it up. At the same time, it seems like even the adult characters have a certain innocence about them, a certain naivete. Certainly the Lisa Ray character, who believes she can get married. Shakuntala, even the woman who runs the ashram, seems not to understand things. You seem to be able to see innocence in so many human beings.
Or stupidity.
Or stupidity, or ignorance. But it is very striking, because they are all humanized in a certain way, and that is what makes the film so powerful. Even the woman who is oppressing the widows within the ashram is herself a kind of confused and misled and misguided person. And that compassion that you have for your characters is really one of the most moving elements of the many in your films. I wonder, you began making films for a time with a children's cooperative. Was it you were making films for children when you first started?
No, I was employed by briefly by Cinema Workshop, which was a small documentary film house in New Delhi, and they made films for the government of India, Indian Films Division, which made documentaries, and that was my first exposure to films. And the first film I made for them was a 2-minute film on how to grow wheat. So it was an interesting exercise, to say the least. I had the camera, the hair below the earth, and then the wheat, and then the sky, and then a farmer smoking his hookah, looking at wheat grow, and there was,
It's far more cinematic than I would have imagined.
And lots of music by Ravi Shankar. It was just the whole gamut. Yes, so that's.
Was that work in making films for children? Is that something that you have taken into your filmmaking as well, or your preference, or say in the two films, choosing to tell the story through the eyes of a child, or is that?
I think I like working with children. I mean, as a director, I really enjoy working with children because they really, kids who want to be actors really want to be actors, and they don't think about that they're going to get famous and rich. They just like performing. So there's a purity about that. And I like working with them because of that. And that certainly is, a really large reason that I'm so excited about Midnight's Children, because of course Salim Sinai is young for a long time.
And also, I think a lot of people don't realize how creative and imaginative documentary films are. And so you were making documentary films as well, and your example of the wheat film has just showed us.
Well, I wouldn't. Yeah, okay.
Well, we won't screen it, not to worry. But how does that fit into your making fictional films? And what did you take from that experience? And how did that help you imagine the fictional worlds in those films that you were making?
I think there was a step before the documentaries, which was doing, I did about 4 dramatic films for television, and they were 1 hour long, and that sort of really whetted my appetite of having a script. So suddenly with a script you can actually control things to a certain degree, and that for me was in fact not restricting but extremely liberating, and got me into an arena which I was sort of aware of, but not, I hadn't practiced it, which is, of course, the fundamentals of any filmmaking, which is the script.
Picking up on some threads of the conversation between Laurie and Christopher Hitchens, you have also been subject to extreme kinds of reactions to your work. A kind of censorship even, with the destruction of the sets for Water in Varanasi, the protests. In America, we don't have censorship per se, overtly, unless it is internalized. But we do get protest groups sometimes if they're offended by, say, the Martin Scorsese film, Last Temptation of Christ. But usually these protests are not very effective. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that experience of trying to be silenced by various groups and then having the fortitude to pick up and make Water in any case. And where did you find the strength after such extreme destructive behavior to be able to move forward with it?
It was not easy. There was, when we were shut down in Varanasi, when the usual bombs and burning of effigies and, death threats and whatever, I was really angry for a long time. And I decided at that point, and there were different provinces in India that said, okay, you can't make it in UP. That was in Varanasi. Why don't you come to our city or our province and make it theirs. So I found myself traveling between different provinces, and I think I was in Calcutta where I was looking at locations and I suddenly stopped. I said, this is crazy. I'm trying to make the film, and everything is saying that to me that I will, if I do the film right now, it's going to be such a compromise, and it's going to be about I'll show you I can do it, and it's going to be about me. It's not going to be about the film. I mean, I can talk like this now because hindsight is perfect. I was furious, and but there was at that moment, sort of that window of an epiphany that said that this is really not right. I'm too angry, and the script is going, which is not about anger, is going to be tainted with that, if you will. And so I said, okay, I'll put it away. And I took the script and I brought it home and I put it in one of those plastic boxes in my basement, and I proceeded to make a comedy. And that was very helpful. Humor is so liberating. And of course, during the whole process, I mean, I kept on thinking, here I am complaining about this. I mean, I thought about Salman, all those years of, and I must say that really helped me. His fortitude, his sense of humor, which to this day is one of the reasons I love him so dearly. I mean, this man is brilliant, but he's very funny. That's great. That's so lovely.
Had you wanted to make a romantic comedy before and just had never?
I'd never wanted to. I mean, I didn't know where I would put the camera for a song and dance number. But I found out, and it was fun.
I guess if one can film wheat growing,
yes, that's true.
Choreograph
yes.
A musical number. I wanted to talk a little bit about how beautiful your films are, how beautifully photographed they are, how beautifully lit they are. You think of some of the nighttime scenes in water, or just the brilliant light that we see in Fire from time to time, the lighting of the lovemaking scene in Earth. And at a certain point, one might say, these films are so beautiful, and yet the suffering of some of the characters is so intense. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you approach visualizing imagery and how that relates to what you're doing with the script.
I think that one of the things that really did inform me, and I think of that right now, was when we were in Varanasi doing water. I mean, Varanasi has to be one of the most beautiful cities in the world. I mean, it's the most dramatic. The sun rises over the desert and the river, and the steps, the carts that lead to the water, and all this, what was happening to us, was happening right there on the banks of the Ganga. And so beauty and, beauty and absolute abject, pain coexist. And I feel that if visually I can do that, it will become a complete film. And I keep on, and one of the films that really, one of the filmmakers that has really helped me in a way to realize that if you're showing suffering, it doesn't have to be the visual, what's on screen doesn't have to be handheld, blurry, it can be beautiful, and somehow that helps the beauty to stand out a bit more. Was seeing years ago a film by Terence Malick called The Thin Red Line, which for me was a perfect amalgamation of all those aspects. The beauty, the pain, the philosophy, love, nature, music coming together with the visuals. And that's why the use of music is very important to me in all the films.
And The Thin Red Line is also all of those things within the context of a film about war. Very much.
Yes, very much
along
so.
the lines of the World War I poetry we were hearing about.
Yeah, what Christopher's.
Is the depiction of trauma, it's something, historical trauma, it's something that I've been interested in also, and particularly how it's represented in film. And there are certain arguments that trauma is impossible to depict, impossible to imagine. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that idea, because obviously you've made very powerful films that convey a sense of historical trauma, historical memory, in very imaginative ways. I'm wondering if you are even familiar with that line of critical thinking about historical trauma, that it can only be partially captured or...
I am aware of it, and it was a very conscious choice about how I decided to, whether it was in earth, because of the partition and because of sectarian war, etc., or whether it was in water, where religion plays such a huge part in the traumatization of a young girl, was that, yes, it is difficult, but I realized that to be brief about it was very important. And to be, and it was that single shot as opposed to a series of explanations about how we got there, which was very important. So brevity has helped me hugely. And while Salman was writing Midnight's Children, I mean, he said, whenever you start thinking about a problem, you should cut it. And that's exactly what it is, even with film, with editing, or even when you're conceiving that you're going to shoot a traumatic scene, or a scene that sort of embodies what has been a very traumatic situation, is be brief. And somehow in that brevity, in that one shot of Chuhia in water, or of Lenny saying, Aya's inside the house, betraying of her nanny, or in Fire, Beachy ringing her bell. Just it's those moments, it's small moments, it's the moment, it's the detail, and how small and how dramatic it is. I think that helps tremendously.
It's an amazing paradox that the small detail can be so global in its implications. I also think about how in Earth you have the scene where this poor man is being tied to two different jeeps to be pulled apart by the mob. And then the little girl who has seen this is tearing apart her doll in her own home, and how that parallel, that analogy really brings home how damaged she has been and how horrible is the thing that she has seen, which you don't show in its entirety. It's an interesting paradox that being so brief or being so elusive can also be so powerful.
Yes.
Perhaps more powerful than showing something directly.
It's worked for me. I mean, I don't know. You can try it.
The idea of religious misinterpretation. Your water was misinterpreted by fundamentalists. You were saying before that you don't set out to critique society or critique religion, and yet often in the trilogy films we see characters who have misinterpreted religion and taken it to such an extreme. I think of the husband in Fire who wants to perfect himself by lying down next to his wife without touching her, to deny all passion. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about your idea of love in relation to religion, given, as we were just hearing, how often its tenets are misinterpreted. And you actually studied Hindu philosophy as a graduate student for a time. So I'm also wondering how that has figured in your depiction of religious observance and belief in the films.
I'm an agnostic, and I just think that, and also coming from India, we're always surrounded by tradition, and tradition is sort of interwoven with religion, and it was something that doesn't, to question it, I think, is imperative. And I've always, even when I was a kid, I was always sort of encouraged to not to just accept. And I must thank my parents for that. I think as an adult, some things just make absolutely no sense to me. And not to question them. They might have been relevant 300 years ago, but their complete irrelevance is so obvious to me that not to address it in some way, or not to try and explore it and to see why it's irrelevant, whether it's an aspect of a religion, is, I find it compelling. I mean, it's sort of being attracted like a moth to a flame. I mean, it's been pretty destructive, but I just can't help being compelled to it. I mean, there's no great reason except that I have an inherent, suspicion of religious adages, because they seem to be so, there's no flexibility for the human spirit in them. And there seems to be no sort of respect for conscience, individual or collective. And many things I feel are so disrespectful and deprive one of human dignity that I don't like them. Yeah.
And yet, in a film like Fire, you have a character named Sita who has to go through a trial by fire. You have the enactment of the story of the king commanding her to demonstrate her purity. And then there is the fire in the kitchen of the characters. And it seems like it's again an ambivalent use of this particular story, because there is a purity about the heroine that is also, you're also taking inspiration from a centuries traditional story. And I'm wondering how you thought about that particular juxtaposition.
Because it's ironic. And as Christopher was saying earlier, that's irony is what I love. And it definitely in Fire, the whole juxtaposition of Sita, Radha, and the trial by fire is completely ironic. In Water, there's a lot of irony about the texts and how widows should be treated and how they're not, and why they are being relegated to the life that's been relegated to, according to the Manu Shastra, or in Earth. And a poem comes to mind by one of my favorite poets, Faiz Ahmed Faiz. I don't know, it's a marvelous Urdu poet, and he talks about, he says, और भी राहतें हैं ज़माने में फ़सल की राहत के सिवा, मुझसे पहली सी मोहब्बत मेरे महबूब न मांग. So that there are many other aspects, we were talking about love, and to come back to it, than just pure love. There are many arenas to find peace other than just pure romantic love. And it's the whole question of nationalism and being an agnostic, and finding that it's a very Sufi-ish poem about peace. And perhaps that is the most important form of love.
It's very powerful. And again, I think of all the demonstrations of love in your films. I think of Chuya running to get that candy for that old widow, because that's all she talks about, is she wants to have that. And when she actually has it, she has this wonderful memory of her wedding, when someone was feeding it to her. And then shortly after that, she passes away.
I know. They all die. Let's kill them.
Is it true that you had a saying in your family that the only two things you don't know are when you're going to die and how well your film's going to do in distribution?
Yes. My father, who's a film distributor, said that to me, and I told him that I didn't want to become an academic, but I wanted to become a filmmaker. And he said, okay, but you must remember two things. One is you'll never know when you're going to die, and the other is you'll never know how your film's going to do, so best of luck. That was that.
I have time to ask you one last question, and I'd rather not end on a note about death or distribution, for that matter. You have said that you absolutely love making films, and that you're happiest, yeah, I think you said the other night, you're happiest when you're on set and creating. Could you talk about what it is? Is it the combination of working with all these people together in a common goal? Is it what is it that you find so wonderful about it?
Being on set, I think that the reason I really love being on set is because of the relief what I had to go before being on set is over. Because pre-production is called pre-production hell for a very good reason. It's the worst. So you take about 8 weeks or 9 weeks to prepare for a film, and you look at all aspects of it. It's just the casting, it's also the locations and the logistics of making a film, where your camera is going to be, so where the catering truck is going to be. I mean, it's just awful. So when the day finally arrives that you can actually shoot, it's just heavenly, because you go on set and you say, action, and magic happens, so I love it.
Well, and we love seeing the results of that magic. And again, I want to remind everyone, we'll continue this conversation Sunday at 5, talking then about not pre-production hell, but the process of adapting Midnight's Children. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.